When Crash Bandicoot was released in 1996, I don't think Naughty Dog truly anticipated how fast their orange creation would take off into the stratosphere. Crash being the first mascot for the Sony PlayStation was a tremendous help to solidify him as a force to be reckoned with on the tail end of the 1990s and for a little while into the early 2000s. When the first game's popularity soared to infinity and beyond, the company knew they had something big on their hands and immediately started development on the sequel. By immediately, I mean less than a month after they had released the first game, with Crash Bandicoot 1 being released in September 1996, while development started for Cortex Strikes Back in October 1996. PlayStation knew they had a cash cow, and they wanted to milk it by any means necessary since they saw the ability it had to rival the Nintendo 64 at the time. But did Crash Bandicoot 2 improve on its predecessor, or did it lack substance thanks to a potentially rushed development? Join me as we uncover the answers to these questions in our retrospective of Crash Bandicoot 2: Cortex Strikes Back. The beginning cutscene picks up straight from the ending of Crash Bandicoot 1. It's here that we're introduced to the main collectible that pretty much every future entry will revolve around: Power Crystals. The Power Crystals are the driving force of the series, said to hold incomprehensible power and are primarily used by Cortex as an energy source to power his creations. The scene fades to black, and we're met with a 1 year later title card that shows that during this year, Cortex has been busy building himself a base high above the earth, which also houses a new and improved Cortex Vortex. It's also here that we're introduced to Cortex's new assistant, Dr. Engine, who has replaced Nitrous Brio since his disappearance in the last entry. Cortex's voice actor in this game is Clancy Brown, the same voice actor as Mr. Krabs from the SpongeBob series, and replaces Brendan O'Brien from here up to the Wrath of Cortex. Clancy seriously nails the ambience and vibe of Cortex being a menacing and powerful villain, giving him the aura of someone hot on the heels of formulating a plan that could not possibly fail this time around. While O'Brien does a great job, I think it was a good way to separate the two characters into their own by giving them specific voice actors tailored to their personalities.
You fool! Do you think I'm unaware of the situation? If we don't have any friends left on the surface, then we need to find an enemy.
You moron! This Bandicoot will be my general, and he will lead my Cortex commandos to world domination. This time I shall reign triumphant!
After Cortex's monologue, we fade over to Crash sitting on an Insanity Beach with his sister Coco. This is the first time we see Coco in the series, and she continues to appear in nearly every major Crash release from here on out. After demanding to get her another laptop battery, the game finally lets the player take control of Crash, and we begin the story. The first thing we notice here is the clear upgrade in graphics and physics. Crash instantly feels lighter and smoother to control, with a little less weight behind his jumps compared to the first game, where he feels stiff and heavy. This time, the backdrop and graphics have received a significant upgrade, resulting in a more polished environment with smoother statues and mushrooms in the jungle. It's not much to look at today, but I'm sure there were many kids and even teenagers back then thinking to themselves that graphics truly couldn't get any better. Another thing to note is that the music seems less crunchy than the first game, and sounds a lot more high fidelity than Crash 1 when you compare them side by side. The core of the game is still the same, running through the jungle, breaking crates and collecting Wumpa Fruit. Once again, crates can potentially equal lives or Aku Aku Masks to help with an extra point of damage in dire situations. The first enemy we come across is also an entirely new enemy type, which is the Armadillo. I can't help but suspect that this is simply a variation of the skunks we get in Crash Bandicoot 1, but their model is different enough that I can let it pass and not think about it too much. They have also slightly upgraded Crash's moveset here, allowing him to body slam when pressing the circle button after jumping, which adds to the sense of further development to the game. Reaching the end of the level teleports us away prematurely, and we find ourselves inside the warp room, being spoken to by a hologram of Cortex. I can really appreciate Naughty Dog doing more voice acting this time around. The first game only featured talking in its opening cutscene, but in comparison, the characters in this game speak and are a lot more prominent on screen, resulting in a better portrayal of their personalities. Cortex asks us to find at least 25 power crystals because he wants to save the world, which is obviously a load of crap, but because Crash is about as smart as a bucket of bolts, we agree to help. The warp room is the replacement for the map from the first game, intending to give us an illusion of choice in the level we want to play to progress the overarching story. The map was a neat concept, but having this room to replace it gives us the impression that we're in a smaller part of a much larger world. The first level we enter is Turtle Woods. Once again, with the previous video, we'll only be covering levels that introduce new concepts or mechanics because the early games do rehash and reuse a lot of designs. This game introduces the concept of spawning inside of a room at the very start of the level, which to my knowledge doesn't return in any future Crash games. I'm unsure of the design choice behind this, but I suspect it was just a way of showing off the graphical upgrades. Naughty Dog built Crash 2 entirely from the ground up during development, with Crash 1's engine being thrown out completely to wake more for more polygons and polish. This level also features heavy rain, which further drives the idea of being an improved product when you consider that the only time we even got rain in Crash 1 was in the level's slippery climb. Around the halfway point of the level, we run into a circle on the floor that's a secret path. These paths serve as a way to intrigue the player and also show off Crash's new moves like the body slam, which is the only way to enter these kinds of entrances. Once inside, we find a new enemy, or rather a variation of an existing one. The turtles from the first game now have heavy deformities, including spikes on the side of their shells and a cyborg-like eye on their heads. The only way to beat them is to jump on top of them, forcing them to retract into their shell and then spinning them away. Further along, we see another variation of a previous enemy, the vulture from the slippery climb level of Crash 1. This time, being a bright purple colour with a cyborg eye, it's clear that either Cortex or Engine have been busy. It's here that we're shown a new type of crate for the series, the Nitro crates. These bright green crates will explode instantly if touched, not giving enough time to back off unlike their counterpart, the TNT crates. We're also shown the idea of slide jumping, which allows us to clear sizable gaps over obstacles that would otherwise kill us, as shown here. Leaving the path takes us to where we initially entered, and we're able to continue through the level. Up ahead, we find our first bonus entrance. Similarly to the secret path, these are tucked away sections that can offer some extra lives and Wumpa Fruit. This time around, the method of entering them completely changes, replacing the idea of bonus tokens, which I can't say I entirely agree with. I understand that a year after the release of the first game, most people have probably gotten their hands on a memory card for their consoles, removing the need for level codes to save their progress. But I think that finding the bonus tokens was a fun way to reward the player for destroying every box, giving a sense of excitement when coming across a token that wasn't Tawna's. Even though Naughty Dog removed it as a method for saving the game, they could have still kept the same concept and replaced the bonus tokens with other boss tokens to maintain the charm. The last enemy we run into is the mole, which serves to get in our way by attacking us as we get trapped in some pits. Their design is rather cool and unique, being the first enemy we see that chooses to attack from below instead of approaching from elsewhere on or off screen. Killing them all allows us to breeze through the rest of the level, grabbing our power crystal and returning to the warp room. Just like its predecessor, the game does an excellent job at having its first stage somewhat of a tutorial, but not exactly telling us what to do, allowing us to figure it out for ourselves. Cortex congratulates us on our job well done, but is quickly intercepted by Coco, who's attempting to hijack his broadcast signal. This being done is a subtle way to let us know that Coco is insanely intelligent, and despite being mutated by Cortex, she wasn't exactly weak-willed enough to become another one of his minions. The second level we enter is called Snow Go, and the first ever polar-based stage we see in the series. As soon as we exit the first room, we're given an Aku Aku box to help us with the level, but if you already have two, you're given invincibility for the next 20 seconds, which once again shows that the skill reward system I mentioned in the Crash 1 video is still very much in place for its sequel. In this stage, we're introduced to a bunch of new enemy types as well, such as the penguins that spin in Crash's path, and the seals that serve to be more of a nuisance than anything. It's also here that we're shown an entirely new concept of environmental traversal. While Crash Bandicoot 1 introduced sliding in the form of the frozen planks in the level Road to Nowhere, this level just straight up drops a giant frozen path in front of us, which forces us to slip and slide our way to safety. This can leave the player in an awkward state of just moonwalking in one spot if gravity isn't in your favour. and although it is a fun little addition, it's more of an annoyance than an actual obstacle that requires thinking. Apart from that, this level doesn't offer anything else particularly interesting or innovative, and we grab our next power crystal to head back to the warp room. Level 3 is Hang 8, and more or less just a rehash of the levels from Crash 1 such as Upstream and Up the Creek. In the last video, I made a note that these kinds of levels have a lot to offer, but ultimately miss the mark on what they aim to achieve, and it's in this game that it delivers on its promise of being an actual fun challenge instead of just being tedious. The level opens up pretty normally, and what you'd expect for a Crash game, a few platforms and enemies to get over, and then you reach the end of the path to find something new in the form of the jetboard. Naughty Dog's willingness to experiment with ways to make Crash bounce and spin his way through levels is evident as soon as we jump on the board, and it's greatly appreciated in these levels. Riding down the river, we're approached with two problems. Not only do we have a bunch of landmines in our way, but we also have a timer on our screen implicating that when it hits 0, something bad is probably going to happen. This gives the idea that we need to be fast, and we need to be careful, which is a good way of letting us get a solid feel of how to control Crash and the vehicles we're given in this new engine so early in the game. In the next stage, I don't have a lot to say about it. The pits is pretty much a recreation of Turtle Woods, which is something that the early Crash games suffered with in terms of production. While the general layouts of the levels may differ, the environments and the enemies found in these levels are almost exclusive to their style. You won't find a penguin in Hang 8 for example, or a man-eating plant in Snow Go ready to chomp on Crash. The only reason I even bring up the pits is because it does give us a new enemy variation, which is the Buzzsaw Turtle. This variation is the polar opposite of the Spike Turtle, requiring us to slide into it to get rid of it as opposed to jumping on it. Outside of that, this stage doesn't stand out as something fascinating. After we're done here, we enter the last level of the first warp room, Crash Dash. This level is just a rehash copy of levels like Boulders and Boulder Dash from Crash 1. While they are enjoyable levels to play, they leave a little to be desired when we've just spent time riding jetboards or fighting gravity in the snow. I think these kinds of levels being in the sequel were more of having a sense of return to familiarity, which isn't needed a whole lot when we've already had one-to-one environments from the first game, just slightly more polished. What makes this level stand out from its predecessors is the fact that there are some more aggressive obstacles in our way, which are the electric fences. Additionally, the game adds nitro crates as obstacles in our path, which intensifies the sense of panic. However, considering how much I love this level in the first game, it feels out of place to encounter it so early in its sequel, and I feel it would have been more appreciated if they introduced it later in the game. Leaving this level behind marks the end of the first warp room section, and also takes us to our first boss. Because the map has been completely removed in this entry, each warp room is instead on a story-based system, and requires us to use the platform in the center to travel between levels. The first boss battle in this game is Ripperoo, who apparently has grown some hair and begun to educate himself in the last year. Instead of having numerous platforms to jump between, they completely remove that danger and place us in a giant slab with Ripper's face on it. This fight entails us simply running around and avoiding the boss, as he plants down nitro crates to try to take out Crash, with the only way for us to damage him is simply waiting for him to jump back on a nitro crate and stun himself so we can spin to win. I can't begin to emphasize how disappointed I am with this fight. There were so many ways that Naughty Dog could have innovated with their new engine, but they just decided not to. With the only change being the environment and his attack method, I can't help but feel that the 1-year turnaround between games had some heavy effects on the final polished product. The use of the nitro crates isn't very intuitive either. I understand wanting to use a new crate as a way to show off, but at this point we as the player know that we can't touch the crates as we'll just end up losing a life instantly. The first game added a sense of strategy and pattern to the battle, making us time where Ripper would land to make sure we weren't in the way of him or the TNT crate, whereas this time all the boss comes down to is waiting for him to stop bouncing and maybe jump out of the way of an explosion. Ending the fight is also the first time we're presented with Crash's iconic dance instead of the typical jump he does at the end of a boss battle. Returning to the warp room, we're greeted by Cortex on a job well done, before Coco can jack into his broadcast signal again and tell us not to trust him like we have a choice in the matter. Continuing to collect more crystals, we run into level 8, Bear It. This is the first level in the game that brings back the concepts of Hog Wild and Whole Hog from Crash 1, but just like the game did with Hang 8, it does this a little better. Instead of riding a hog, Crash jumps on the back of a baby polar bear and is off to speed through tight gaps and jump over icy water. This stage also shows us the orca enemies for the first time, as they try to jump out of the water to stop us from progressing, which is a neat addition of an ice-based level having more marine-based enemies. The level is also very short, but overall, it is a fun and fast-paced section that has a brighter environment than Hog Wild does. We quickly breeze through Crash Crush, which is just a clone of Crash Dash, and we continue to enter the Eel Deal, which is the first time we see a new environment since Snow Go. This stage's outlay is the most original that we have seen so far. Set in a sewer system, the small and claustrophobic corners nail the feeling of being stuck in, well, a sewer. The soundtrack matches the whole vibe of a steampunk-esque environment, while also being somewhat electrifying. While on the topic of electrifying, this is the first time we meet the electric eel, which makes sense when you consider the name of the stage. These slimy little enemies aim to keep us on our toes and keep us fast, since they'll electrify the water randomly while we run through it, which will send us straight back to our checkpoint crate. The stage adds so much up for us to fight our way through, and introduces the most enemy types in the game so far, showing us spike rats, scrubbers, and even fan blades. Just like Snow Go, the Eel Deal adds a new means for us to traverse our way through the level, giving us grates to jump up onto and climb across. To me, this level is the lost city of Crash 2, and adds so much stuff that forces us to use our new moveset and appreciate that when the environments aren't recycled, Naughty Dog can legitimately create a great level that's original, fun, and invigorating for the player. Skipping through Air Crush and Snowbeers because they're just copies of Hang 8 and Snow Go, Cortex once again congratulates us on our progression, and we're ready for the second boss. The Komodo brothers are the first original boss fight we encounter in the game, being completely new characters to the series and also insanely fun to fight. The general look and design of the boss is absolutely fantastic, and has a vibrant and amazing soundtrack to go along with it. This is also the first time in the series that we don't get a boss that's based off an Australian native animal. It can be argued that Komodo dragons are from Australia, but ultimately, the closest thing we have are goannas. However, I can see how the Komodo brothers rolls off the tongue a little bit better than the goanna brothers does. Komodo Mo and Komodo Joe take turns fighting Crash, with Joe standing in the middle throwing swords around the room, while Mo spins towards Crash to deal damage. Once Mo has stopped spinning, he'll get dizzy, which allows us to spin into him and knock him straight into Mo, which needs to be repeated 3 times before we can defeat the boss, and I said the word Komodo way too many times in this part of the script. Sadly, the next warp room is filled with rehashed levels such as Sewer or Later and Bear Down, and there are only 2 original levels for me to discuss. The first level is Road to Ruin, and if you watched my last video, you'd know how much I love the Lost City from Crash 1, which this stage is a rendition of. Road to Ruin leaves the sunset of its predecessor behind and throws us into darkness. While there's still enough light to see, it is enough to heavily alter the vibe of the level overall, and the music in this level slaps just as hard. Here, the lizards from the Lost City have been through some stuff, and now sport an orange fiery frill around their neck, meaning the only way to get rid of them is to slide into them. There are also many more obstacles in this level, featuring falling platforms if stood on for too long, and giant rotating stone gorilla heads that shoot flames from their mouths as you run through. More than that, the stage seems to have the most enemy placement by far at this point in the game, with almost every new platform having at least one enemy waiting on the other side. Going back to what I said about Crash Dash a little earlier, having something like Road to Ruin pop up at the halfway point made me appreciate its return much more, since I'd seen a lot of the new stuff the game had to offer up until now. It was enjoyable to revisit the sense of nostalgia, because the game didn't force it upon me within the first 5 levels. Exiting the Road to Ruin brings us to the next stage, Unbearable. I wasn't initially going to discuss this level at all, but revisiting it, it does bring some stuff up worth discussing. Unlike Crash Dash or Crash Crush, the thing chasing Crash in this level isn't a boulder, but a giant polar bear, which is something I enjoyed much more than the levels I've just mentioned. It adds a greater depth to the game, showing that you're not the only animal that calls the islands their home. Being chased by a polar bear is so much more scary than a simple boulder, because while a boulder will crush you, a polar bear will just fucking eat you. Between each section, instead of a rock just hitting a wall and stopping, the bear keeps sliding and gets stuck, which is a lot more satisfying to see as opposed to simply a blocked entrance. What truly makes this level come together is the last half of it, where Polar appears and is waiting for the player. Jumping on the small bear to ride while attempting to escape from the giant creature chasing you is just so damn awesome to play through, and makes this level stand apart from so many others. Ending Unbearable brings us to the third boss in the game, Tiny Tiger. Tiny is based on a Tasmanian tiger, which has been extinct for hundreds of years now, which also makes you wonder whether Cortex would ever go full Jurassic Park if he ever actually took over the world. As a kid, I also liked the idea of some big buffed out tiger being named Tiny. I mean, these days I know that's the whole joke, but this was peak comedy in its purest form when I was younger. The boss battle at its core is pretty generic, playing out the same way Ripperoo's does from Crash 1, with the player timing Tiny's jumps as he leaps around from platform to platform, trying to make sure he lands on one that will fall off screen, which allows us to damage him. What makes this fight enjoyable is the rhythmic aspect of it. It's pretty fun timing your jumps as Tiny leaps across platforms, and gives a weird sense of synchronization that tickles the brain. To top it all off, the soundtrack for this fight goes way harder than it has any right to. With 15 crystals down, we can now move on to the fourth warp room, which, thanks to crappy asset recycling, only houses one completely original level, with the other four simply being iterations. As much as I love Road to Ruin, I highly doubt Ruination would have anything new to offer, so I'll spare you the rant. The only original level in this warp room is Digging It, which is oddly enough repeated twice in the 5 levels, with its iteration being Behaving. I can accept having different level variations spread across 25 levels, but having 2 of those be within the same bunch of 5 comes down to straight laziness. The premise of Digging It is pretty cool, as it introduces yet another way to traverse our way through the level by adding flooring that allows us to dig to escape the various beehives spread across the map. The initial environment looks similar to the boulder levels that appear, but the general layout is different enough to be forgiven. There's also the return of the man-eating plants in this stage, except instead of lunging at you, they've been given a ranged attack in the form of a seed bomb that can explode and kill us if it's too close. The level itself isn't revolutionary or game-changing, but it offers a pleasant change of pace from the 4 reused stages in this warp room. Finishing the level allows us to move on to the fourth boss. With Engine being the surrogate replacement of Brio in this game, it makes sense to have him being the final thing between you and Cortex. This fight is something I'm not sure how to feel about. It is fun and original, with nothing really comparing to it in the series, but the initial setup just feels confusing. I remember playing as a kid not knowing what to do at all, only learning that I could throw Wumpa fruit towards him after trying to spin. In retrospect, yeah, I was a stupid kid, but the aiming and timing of the fruit is also very unfair, and something I struggled with even returning to this series as an adult. The idea is amazing. Being able to fight and take down a mech with only some fruit is right up Crash's alley, since it's never been about being stupidly overpowered. The execution here is what's done poorly. While I had the pleasure of being able to play this game in 1080p at 60 frames per second, kids 26 years ago were limited to janky 30 frames per second on 18-inch CRT TVs that only had 480p resolution at the absolute best. I feel like this boss fight overall isn't a horrible one, but for its time, I can only begin to imagine the rage that kids across the world must have felt at missing an attack that definitely should have hit, and a concept like this should have been saved for a later entry. Warp's Engine fight does massively improve in this idea, so much so that it's probably one of the best in the series, but that's something we'll cover later. After 5 phases of health, Engine is ejected straight into space where his creepy looks belong, and we're able to enter the final warp room of the game. Thankfully, unlike Warp Room 4, there are 3 original levels I can speak about in this section, but they do have their fair share of issues. The first level is Piston and Away. Set inside Cortex's space station, the stage does a fantastic job of letting us know that we're nearing the end of the game. In the first game, the Cortex levels felt like they came a lot sooner. But when you consider that Crash 1 had 32 levels, while Crash 2 only has 25, or 30 if you consider the secret levels, mathematically speaking, the pacing is about right. Keeping true to its name, the biggest obstacle in this stage are the series of pistons that push up and down, requiring us to be fast and precise in the way we maneuver our way through to the end. This level also offers a load of new enemy types that stand in our way, such as the robot walkers, the tentacle robots, and the ladder system, the last of which makes the scariest death sound I'd ever heard as a kid. The tentacle robots are probably the most intuitive in their design, and aim to merge the idea of the spike turtle and buzzsaw turtle into one, as they rotate their tentacles between animations, which can be deadly when you go to jump on them just for them to defend the upper half of their body. These are the only real enemies in the stage that provide an actual challenge, which is both respected and disappointing. Leaving the stage takes us to my personally most hated level design in the entire series, the jetpack levels. I can understand and acknowledge those who love these kinds of sections, but my only question is why? Before commenting skill issue, I uploaded challenge runs on this channel for 2 years before moving on to retrospectives. I'm no stranger to things being made difficult for the sake of being difficult, and this level of theme simply comes down to poor design and controls. It would have been much more enjoyable if they were formatted in the concept of a side-scroller, which the devs had made pretty clear they're not afraid of, with most levels in the original trilogy having at least one side-scrolling section. Instead, they opted to have the camera angle in the same vein as the one in Road to Nowhere, which just makes the entire thing completely unenjoyable. Combined with the crappy enemy and obstacle placement, the entire level within itself just serves as nothing more than a thing to be in the way, and to add pad time to the endgame, which is done in the form of horrible difficulty scaling. Just like most other levels in the game, it feels like the only reason this one even exists is just for Naughty Dog to say, hey, this is a new game engine now, look at what we can do with it. To put it nicely, I'll just let Jeff Goldblum explain.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Moving on from my personal equivalent of sleep paralysis, we enter Night Fight, one of the closing levels in the game that more or less is just a level Lights Out from Crash 1. While Lights Out was simple enough in its design, Crash 2 does what it does best and takes levels from Crash 1 and just makes them better. Fireflies replace the Aku Aku masks from the first, giving more value to the world Crash lives in. Instead of depending on something we've smashed out of a crate, we're allowed to have something that actively lives in the world to help us fight our way through to the end. Another thing this stage does well is the addition of enemies in between the darkness, adding a higher sense of urgency to our goals. My only issue with this level is the spawning of said enemies, with most of them hiding around the corners that the light can't seem to reach, only to appear at the last second and make their presence known. However, coming straight off something like Rocket or Pack Attack makes this level so much more fun than it has any right to be. Just like its counterpart, it seems to suffer from the effect of being placed after a bunch of notoriously difficult stages, which makes it a very welcoming break. With the closing out of the other stages, Coco appears to tell us that Cortex is lying to us and plans to use the crystals we've been gathering to power the new Cortex Vortex and hit the entire planet at once. This conversation leads us to our next and final boss, Neo Cortex. I can't begin to describe the sheer and absolute disappointment this fight is. Yes, some fights before this have been average in quality, but this one is just something I refuse to acknowledge as a true boss fight in any form of gaming. I hate to compare it, but even the final fight against Rise in Dying Light, which was nothing but a quick time event, is much more enjoyable than this. The only thing we as the player do here is simply chase Cortex and spin into him to damage him once we've caught up. That's it. The only thing that is actively a threat here are the mines and floating asteroids, which don't even damage you or kill you, just serve as a way to slow you down. Cortex reaching the end sends us to the start of the level, and it rinses and it repeats. No second phase, no big mech fight, that's it. The fight itself goes for no longer than 2 minutes, and that's putting it generously. To put that into perspective, the world record speedrun holder for Crash 2 successfully beats this fight in 20 seconds. That's with no glitches or speedrun tactics, just simply playing the game faster. The entire battle as a whole feels more like an intro to a fight as opposed to actually being one. It could have been improved so much more if this section focused on us dealing damage, with Cortex reaching the end no matter what to segue into a giant spaceship fight. The damage we'd deal in the first phase would carry over, with the second phase having a health bar size on the level of Brio's from the first game. We're already wearing the jetpack. Naughty Dog simply could have given us the ability to throw Wumpa Fruit in a second phase and have some huge outer space battle, but we got this absolute dumpster fire instead. Beating Cortex brings us to the end of the game, with once again the true ending being locked behind 100% completion, or in the case of this game, 102%. A theme that Naughty Dog carries well and truly into the end of its future Jak and Daxter series. This game does hold up, and it is an excellent entry into the series, but it has way too many flaws to ignore. I mentioned a few times that Crash 2 had an entirely new engine built from scratch, and I think that's what actually hurts this game more than it helps it. The turnaround time from Crash 1 to Crash 2 was a year, meaning that within that 12-month time space, they not only had to create new levels and ways to appease the fan base, but also create those levels that worked in a completely foreign engine. It's because of this that I truly feel that Crash 2's level design ultimately comes off as weak and subpar, with most of the stages being recycled assets from one another, or being levels from the first game. Crash 2 had the potential to be a truly greater game than it is, but a tiny development window didn't allow it. It does its best to be a polished sequel that's brought down by its ambitiousness to be better. I'd go as far to say that Crash 2 is maybe even the weakest in the original trilogy, and feels like the middle ground of perfection. Many Crash games after this missed the mark, and are much worse than this entry. But at a time when Crash had solidified its space in the gaming world with its first entry, the sequel was way too big for its own boots. I know Crash 2 is absolutely beloved by the fanbase, and despite all its issues, I still love it too. It's an amazing improvement on the first and added so much more, but its flaws stick out like a sore thumb. If you reach this point in the video, I thank you very much. This was a little longer than the previous one, and I really appreciate those who stick around to help out and listen to me ramble on for as long as I do. The end of this video marks the beginning of the next one, which is a retrospective of Crash 3, and you can expect to see that pretty soon. If you want to see more, consider subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you all next time.